It's the fundamental premise of this course that humans are social beings. And we've spent the last 4 or 5 weeks talking about some of the social processes that in fact operate. Is that microphone too echoey? Shall I turn it down a bit? It's okay? All right. So we've been talking about a number of sort of fundamental social processes. It should also be clear that during the life course, the very definition of the life course involves social events. So in the last class, we spoke, for example, about falling in love, intimate relations, and marriage. Today, we're going to expand or extend the social events and think about beginning a family. And again, it's in line with the very fundamental notion of humans as social beings. And from here on in, we're going to ask the question, what is it that the family does to help make their own children more social, more responsive to the needs and the well-being of other people, a process we're going to call socialization. But today I want to get the baby born for you. I want to move from the dyadic level, that is, the husband and wife or the two lovers, to beginning a family and to reflect for a little while on why people become involved. Why do they ever have children? I should point out that the fact that this is a choice is really only a function of reliable contraception. And so it's only ever been an issue, a decision that has to be made over the last 20, 30 or 40 years. Until then, there was no serious decision making involved. In terms of moving from sort of the marital couple to a family, there are 2 decisions that need to be made. First of all, whether or not the couple wants to have children at all, or whether they want to remain childless, voluntarily childless. And the second decision is when they want to begin to have a family, at what age, at what point in their own personal relationship, at what point in terms of their career life cycle, and so forth. And as I said, both of these issues hinge on there being available contraception that makes such decisions possible. All right, well, why do people have children? We would think, if we consider it just very quickly and superficially, that there'd be many arguments against having children. Let me see if I can have the class generate. What are the arguments against having children? Why would people want to remain childless? Yes?
Expensive.
It's expensive. It costs a lot of money. Recent estimates coming from the Midwest that indicate that to raise a child in the Midwest in a lower middle class family is cost approximately $100,000 per child. I rush to add this estimate doesn't include expenses like the orthodontist, summer camps, ballet or music lessons, and it certainly doesn't include attending Stanford. So if we were to end some upper middle class additions to sort of the basic child rearing costs, you can be thinking in terms of between $200,000 and $250,000 for each child that you bring into this world. So expense is one reason. If you want to be wealthy, you probably shouldn't have children. Another reason why we don't have children, yes?
The growth rate of the population is so great that people may morally choose to limit their family size.
Some concern with overpopulation, the large movement begun some years ago for zero population growth. 2 ways which this has been spelled out. One, to just have the sort of replacement number of children, not more. Another version of that is that we shouldn't bring children into an overpopulated, and I'll extend it a little bit, a troubled world, a world where there's a threat of nuclear war and so forth. It's a second reason. Why else? Yes? Yes, it's not just money, and it's not just the troubled world, but it's also an enormous and immense commitment of time and energy and effort, and it has to come from somewhere. Traditionally, it's been the woman's role, and men have gone to work and women have stayed at home and raised children. In more recent years, women have been entering the labor force very much at a much greater rate, and the question is, who will devote the time to raising and rearing the children? So it's a third reason. Other reasons why people mightn't want to have children? Yes? Yes. I mean, if you're going to have to spend 20 years or so with children, and there isn't an easy way out when you have children. I mean, you can leave a marriage, you can get a divorce, you can get a separation, but there isn't a very easy procedure whereby you divorce yourself from your children. The only option that one would have would be abandonment, and it's not an option that's thought of highly in our society, nor is it an option that's practiced very often. So that it's a very long-term commitment, so that if you don't like children, you need to think long and hard whether you want to make this 20-year commitment with enormous effort and time and energy and money and all of the other things as well. Well, all right, you've persuaded me. Why then does anybody ever have children? I mean, why is it that 90% of all married couples in fact choose to have children? We put together an impressive list of reasons why we shouldn't have children. Why do people have children? Why did your parents have you? Terrible thought if they decided not to. Yes?
Because they're actually fun.
Yeah. They're really fun. I'm the mother of 3 sons. I should tell you that from the beginning. 1 son here at Stanford, 2 16-year-old twin boys that I'll talk about a fair amount during the course of the next lectures. I've been forbidden to talk about my Stanford son now that he's old enough to be known, but I can still talk about the younger children. Children are fun, all right? They're not just fun in terms of just having a good time, but they add a dimension of richness and of meaning to one's life. Why else? Yes?
I would think that it's just emotionally satisfying to see something that you brought into this world that is a part of you to grow up into a full human being, you know, that you were a distinct part of making that.
Right. I think there are a few things in what you're saying. One, the sense of sort of ongoing, continuing oneself through another. 2, the links with the historical past. You are a continuation of your family, and this child will be a continuation of you. If I push this argument a little bit further, there's also something about the love relationship in marriage whereby you want to give rise to something that's not just you yourself, but a product of the union, of the relationship between you and your spouse. So it's a new product that's a reflection of the bonds between husband and wife. That's another reason some people have children. Any other reasons? Yes?
For someone to take care of you when you get older?
I think this is, I heard some people chuckling. In many parts of the world, this is the only form of life insurance, the only form of social security that you have is the children who will be there to look after you when you become old and infirm. And so it's certainly in many parts of the country, that's a very good reason for having children. We think of it less in our own society. We think of it less, at least in terms of, in monetary terms, but in terms of meeting our emotional needs, I think it may well contribute to the motives that people have for having children. All right. We do know, regardless of whether the fact that people make conscious, rational decisions or they just let nature take its course, that 90% of all people marry and 90% of all married couples have children. Of the married couples who don't have children, by far the largest portion are those who are unable to have children. And this is not a small problem in their lives. This is seen as an unmitigated disaster. There are fertility clinics where people spend thousands of dollars in their efforts to have children, so that we can see that there are really very profound internal reasons when one moves into their 20s, late 20s or 30s. There's really a significant press to have children that's internally driven as well as culturally sanctioned. And we didn't mention the fact that there are also cultural pressures for people to have children. You'll get pressure from your parents who'll say, I want to become a grandmother. You'll get pressures from your friends. So there are also cultural pressures as well as internal pressures. But people who cannot have children feel very much as if life has dealt them a difficult set of cards to deal with, as if life's been unfair. And of course there are other alternatives. There is adoption, a long tradition in our society, and recently there are sort of other ways in which people seek children. I refer to surrogate mothers, and I refer to in vitro fertilization. So that the press to have children is very powerful, and society is constantly seeking ways to make children available to those who cannot have them on their own. Well, The decision then is not so much for most parents as to whether or not to become parents. If 90% of all married couples make that decision, it's more when to have children, how to fit it into their life plans, into their life works, into their relationships with one another and so forth. Amongst the educated samples amongst the middle class, we find in recent years there is an increasing postponement of having the first child. In the 1980s, twice as many women postponed having their children until they were in their 30s as did in the 1970s. Women have used the time to extend their studies, to gain a hold in the career market, to contribute to the family income. People sometimes wait until they've had an opportunity to travel, to have a good time, or to even get the marriage off onto a stable relationship, to be able to devote time to one another and to really get the marriage sort of stable and settled. Some people don't make a decision at all. They just adopt a wait-and-see strategy, and usually you don't have to wait very long before you see. Most couples become pregnant within the first 6 months of not using contraception, and that figure is even true for teenagers, and I'll talk more about teenage mothers next class. Well, let's assume we've got a mythical couple. They've made a decision to have children. They've now made a decision that they want to have children, let's say at the time they're in their late 20s or early 30s. What's the pregnancy experience like? First of all, I want to indicate that while technically only the woman is pregnant, the man too has an experience during his wife's pregnancy. This is not an issue that's incidental to men. It's an issue that really occupies a significant amount of their energy, of their time, and of their thinking. So I'll talk about the pregnancy experience for women and the expectancy experience for men. And if I sometimes lapse and talk about the pregnancy experience for men, you'll understand that none of the men I'm talking about have ever technically been pregnant themselves. This is a vicarious experience via their wives. First of all, becoming pregnant for the couple is really a very important issue. It's an issue that's usually greeted in the context of marriage with some celebration, with some trepidation, and with some anxiety. For women, relatively quickly, the pregnancy comes to dominate their lives in terms of thinking, in terms of planning, in terms of what they read. They prepare by taking classes, by talking to others, to seeing doctors, to increasing their attentiveness to health practices and so forth. One might think that for men this is very much more on the periphery, but in fact, especially by the middle of pregnancy and certainly towards the end of pregnancy, men too are very involved in the expectancy experience. They too read books and magazines. In recent years, they attend classes with their wives, classes in preparation for the childbirth experience and preparation for parenting. And when we ask men, they daydream and actually dream at night about the infant as well. In addition, we find there are mood changes that occur during the course of pregnancy. For the women, especially during the first trimester, there tends to be a fair amount of moodiness, both ups and downs. Towards the second trimester, the predominant mood tends to be one of well-being, feeling on top of the world, as if there is some sort of miraculous experience that they're part of. And in particular, towards the end of the second and the third trimester, there is significant anxiety and fear concerning the well-being of the fetus, whether it's neurologically and developmentally intact, whether it'll be a healthy baby, and so forth. For women, but not men, there's also significant concern about the labor and delivery per se. When we ask men about their anxieties, they too worry about the well-being of the fetus, but they rarely worry about labor and delivery. They have a great deal of confidence in their wives, confidence that the wives themselves do not share. For the men, their sense of anxiety is played out very clearly in one specific domain, and that is fear about the financial security of the infant. So that we found in our own research, when we carried out studies in this area, that men were particularly concerned about whether they could provide for the wife and for the baby. For many men, this is the first time where they're going to be the sole supporter for another human being. In most marriages, certainly in this area, but also nationwide now, women before they have children are in the labour force. In fact, women after they have children are also in the labour force. But especially prior to having children, so that the financial burden does not rest on any one member of the couple, but rests on both. We found in our work, and others have reported similarly, that women often planned to take off some months with the birth of their child. This left the man feeling financially responsible, not just for his wife, but for a dependent child. And it was the sense that the father was going to be dependent. The husband, the father of the baby, would be the sole supporter for the next 20 years of the child, often had the men in a near panic state. And it was not unusual in our research for men to take on 2 jobs and sometimes 3 jobs as well. So they would work 1 job by day, 1 job by night, and they would do additional moonlighting on the weekend. Their anxieties took another form as well. That was in terms of preparation, and we saw what we called nesting behaviour. Men got very involved in fixing the house, in building cradles, in preparing the room. It was just as the behaviour that we see in animals as they create a nest. And men were as involved in this nesting behaviour as were women. All right, physical symptoms. I won't bore you with the litany of small complaints that expectant women have. They have some nausea in the first trimester, they especially fatigue in the last trimester. But what you mightn't be aware of is that men too have increased incidence of physical complaints during the course of their wives' pregnancies. In particular, there is an increase in gastric problems, in stomach upsets, in sleeplessness, and in backaches. Why, might you ask? How can we explain the increased incidence of men's physical complaints during their wives' pregnancy? All right. Can anybody come up with an explanation? Stress, and how might it play itself out? Let's think about Schachter and the epinephrine experiment. We've got husbands who are feeling stressed, anxious, and nothing that you've learned to date in the class helps you interpret the behaviour. They can't recognise it as stress. After all, they're not carrying an extra 15, 20 or 30 pounds on their back. They're not the ones who can't sleep because they can't find a comfortable position. And yet they've got this stress and arousal, and to give it a form, all right, they don't know how to interpret this arousal, so they project it onto physical complaints. We talk about somatic, psychosomatic symptoms. So it's just as we had in the epinephrine experiment with Schachter. It's a labeling of an emotion and a playing out of the emotion in another area, this time in a somatic domain. There are also changes during this time in the sex typing between men and women, and it's rather interesting. In our own research in this area, we were looking at women, many of whom had very clear career trajectories. They'd invested time and effort into their preparation for their careers, and they, almost all of them intended to work as parents, as mothers of babies. They also were couples who prided themselves on their more or less egalitarian division of labour in the household. These were liberated women and liberated men. However, what was interesting is that during the course of pregnancy, we saw significant reversion to more traditional sex typing. Women took on more and more of the housework. Men, as I've already mentioned, fretted more and more about the finances and actually put in more time. And we found that there was for both men and women, we began to see more traditional sex typing, especially with respect to the running of the house, than had been evident previously. At the time that these changes in moods and sex typing was occurring, there was also a significant attachment to the fetus. That is, it wasn't as if the woman was carrying a watermelon under her shirt about which she was quite indifferent. It was just sort of an impediment to easy movement or to sleep, but there was real emotional connection. Husbands and wives frequently talked to the baby, physically talked. They joked to the baby. They prodded the baby. They tried to get into a communication. When the baby would kick, they'd prod back and they'd await a reply. Virtually everybody had a pet name for the baby. It could be a humorous name, or it could be a real name. Sometimes it was a sex-type name. But the connections that husbands and wives were making with the baby were real. Now, men very often felt at a disadvantage here, and they would say to us in our interviews that somewhere they had some envy of their wives because their connection to this infant was only indirect. It was only via the mother's belly, whereas the woman really had the experience of nurturing this child in its profoundest sense. Men frequently reported they would hold the mother's belly in an effort to sort of communicate directly. But it was an issue that they were very aware of. They really wanted to care, they wanted to establish connection, and they were somewhat saddened that they would never have the experience that their wife had, that sort of very intimate connection of actually bearing a child within them. But it was real. If there is an attachment that forms to the fetus prior to the birth of the child, you might expect that if there is a miscarriage, especially if it's relatively late in the pregnancy, in the second trimester or thereafter, there is in fact grieving on the part of the parents. And in fact, we find that is the case, that parents need time to mourn and to grieve the loss of this infant. It's not just a pregnancy and that you can begin again. It's a loss of a particular other being, even though the other being hasn't yet been born. And doctors are increasingly recognizing this, and now, for example, after a miscarriage, parents are in fact encouraged to mourn, to have services for the infant, to talk about the infant, and to treat it not just as sort of, well, it was just a pregnancy, you can begin again tomorrow, don't worry about it, but to take time to really deal with these feelings. You might also anticipate that if the parents become attached during the course of the pregnancy to the fetus, it raises serious problems about surrogate mothers. And you've probably been reading in the press during the last year, there's a very famous case, especially this time last year, concerned a surrogate mother who decided quite late in the pregnancy, after having a contract that she'd spelled out with the parents of the to-be parents of the baby, she decided she couldn't give up this infant. She could not do it, despite the contract, despite the money. And there was a fiercely contested case in the law courts. And the law courts were forced to make decisions in areas where there's been no legal precedent ever before. What constitutes a parent? If it is the ovum of the mother, if it is the sperm of another man, and if there is a legal contract with the man whose sperm it is and his wife, who indeed are the legal parents and what is best for the child? So these are the kinds of issues that arose precisely because a pregnancy is not just harbouring a watermelon or a growth somewhere sort of in one's middle regions, but one really becomes intimately connected with the fetus. The real question that many people want to ask is there any relationship at all between the experience during pregnancy itself and the kind of parent one becomes? Does it mean if you have a difficult pregnancy, if you're not very enamored of the experience, if you feel sick and miserable, that you're going to have most likely a not very good experience of motherhood? Are you going to find it difficult to be a sensitive and caring mother? Or conversely, if you've been anxious and distressed father during the course of the pregnancy, does that bode poorly for your ability to relate to the child and to be a caring, sensitive and good father to the child after its birth? The answer for the women is that there is no connection between the pregnancy experience and the quality of mothering subsequently. In fact, if you like, the mothers make, and we can make, an internal, unstable attribution. It's those pregnancy hormones, it's those somatic changes of pregnancy that lead me to feel so terribly sick or miserable or without energy or whatever it is. Following on the lines of this argument, you probably then won't be surprised when I tell you that for men, there is a relationship between the experience of pregnancy and the experience of fatherhood. we in fact find that men who were stressed and anxious and uncomfortable during the course of their wives' pregnancy found it much harder, felt more stressed and strained subsequently after the baby was born in the first year of parenting. For men, we can make an internal and stable attribution. We can say that what we see during the course of pregnancy is in fact an ability to cope with change and stress. And being pregnant, for the wife being pregnant, this is one stressor for the husband to deal with, and having particularly a very young infant at home is another stressor. And there is some significant continuity between the experience of men during pregnancy and in the first year of parenthood. There was a question somewhere back there a minute ago. You remember the court case, the surrogate mother was Mary Beth Whitehead, and the court ruled that she should not keep the infant, but that she should have access to the infant. She should have visiting rights. So it went to the parents. The parents were both professionals in New York, but it was a very fiercely contested court case. It went on for more than a year, during which case the child, they didn't know where to put the child, with the mother who'd given birth, the birth mother, or with the father and the wife with whom there'd been a contractual agreement. And the interim case, the infant was placed with the father and the wife, and but the court eventually ruled that the birth mother, Mary Beth Whitehead, in fact should have access to the child, should have visiting rights. But it's a legal area that's wide open. They're still looking for precedent. They're still looking to find a way out of the morass of these issues as to what constitutes parenthood. Questions? Comments? All right. Well, just as the infant, the growing fetus, has an impact on the parents, their well-being, their relationship to one another, their views of themselves, their sex typing, their mood, and so forth, so the parents, and especially the mother and her functioning, has an impact on the fetus. So I want to turn now to look at some of the effects that parents have, especially that mothers have, on their infants, the developing infants. The first question that I want to raise is, what is the effect of stress of the mother? Is this communicated to the fetus? Does it in any way impact on the development on the fetus? Does it impact on the mother's birth experience? Does it impact on the infant's subsequent development? Now, ethical work precludes, ethical constraints preclude experimentation on humans in this regard. So the first kind of work I want to describe to you is animal work using an animal model. And I'm aware of the current controversies about the use of animals and the proper care and protection that should be given to animals. But you'll see in this kind of research, as I describe it, that there isn't an easy computer analog for the kind of research, and nor is this research that can or should be done on humans, so we're really left with animal models. So the question was, what is the effect of stress on the fetus and on the fetus's development and on the subsequent experience of the infant after it's born? This work was carried out with rats, and there were 3 groups of rats. There was random assignment of littermates to each of the 3 groups. In each of the 3 groups, there was a common procedure to begin with. The rats were, when they were prior to the pregnancy, were conditioned. They were put into an experimental box, and a buzzer was rung, a buzzer was buzzed, and shortly thereafter they were given an electric shock. There was no escape of the electric shock at all. Very quickly the rats associated the buzzer with electric shock, and they would show a fear response, and this was the same for all 3 groups. They then put the rats back into mating cages. Nature took its course and the rats became pregnant. These were all female rats. And it was then that they were assigned to the 3 groups. The first group, during pregnancy, just on a single occasion, on a few limited occasions, the rats were taken out of their breeding boxes and they were put into the experimental box, and the buzzer was rung, or was buzzed. There was no electric shock, just the buzzer was applied. The rats promptly showed their learning and they exhibited a fear response. And then the rats were put back into their breeding box. So that's the first group. That's the experimental group, was exposed to stress during pregnancy. All right? And the stress was hearing a buzzer that had previously been associated with shock. The second group of rats were taken from their breeding box and put into the experimental box and were just left there for a requisite period of time and then removed, put back to their breeding box. That is, they did not hear any buzzer at all. This is a comparison group. There was a second comparison group also. In the second comparison or control group, the rats were placed in the experimental box. They heard the buzzer ring, and then after, subsequently, some days later, when they gave birth to their rat pups, the rat pups were cross-fostered to other mother rats. Now, why do we need the second comparison group in this study? Why isn't one comparison group sufficient?
To see if the effect was from what happened to the rats while they were pregnant or what happened.
Yes, exactly. The argument is that we want to see if there's an effect on the infant, on the fetus, due to the mother's stress. But it could be that the stress could change the mother's mothering behavior, if you like. Let's say the rat's retrieval of the infant pups, or the cleaning of the infant pups soon after birth, or the nursing of the infant pups. And this wasn't part of the hypothesis, so that's why we needed the second comparison group. People looking confused? Any? Yes?
Would you be worried that it would change their behavior if they recognized it wasn't their baby?
We do know a great deal about cross-fostering of pups, and we know that if you do it at the appropriate time frame, that both the infant and the mother pup, the foster mother, will accept one another without jeopardizing the relationship or the development. That's a good question. Yes?
So you cross-fostered within the group, you're saying?
No. You take another group of mother rats who've just delivered, and you give them these babies that were in the to the stressed mothers. All right. So they're now being raised by mothers who've never been stressed. So the mothering behavior is not jeopardized at all. It's a totally different group of mothers, foster mothers, that you bring in. All right. Now the results were very clear-cut. Rats who were stressed during the course of their mother's pregnancy, that is those whose mothers heard the buzzer, showed more timidity and impaired learning and memory subsequently when they were put in the experimental field than rats who were not exposed to that stress. And the two groups, the group in the experimental group and the second control group, didn't differ at all. So whether or not they were raised by mothers who were stressed or by totally unstressed mothers was unimportant. It was simply their exposure to stress while in uterus as fetus. Well, do we have a human analogue to this? The answer is yes. During wartime, when women who've been pregnant have been followed, they've discovered that there are sometimes unfortunate circumstances. In some of these instances, the mothers discovered that their husbands were missing in action. As you could imagine, this is an absolute extraordinary life stressor, and these women, not surprisingly, were enormously stressed. It was found in this work that the women whose husbands were missing in action and were very stressed, there were immediate changes in the fetus. The fetus became 2 to 3 times more active than the fetuses of non-stressed mothers. The birth was in fact more difficult. At birth, these babies weighed less. They had more feeding difficulties, they were more irritable and cried more during the first year of life. Now notice, because this is real naturalistic research, that is, we took observations as it happened, we didn't have random assignment, we didn't have control groups, we can't really draw very strong conclusions from this research, because it may well have been that the mothers continued to be stressed when the babies were born, and their mothering was in fact altered as well. So it wasn't just the uterine conditions that were altered during the pregnancy, but these mothers, we could guess, were subsequently very uptight, weren't sleeping well, were very depressed, whatever, and therefore perhaps were being less sensitive mothers. Well, we needn't stop with naturalistic research. Naturalistic referring to the fact that you take it as it comes, you don't have good control over the conditions. But the researchers went on to carry out some experiments. Now, we can't impose stress on people because that wouldn't be ethical, but we can do the converse. I mentioned to you before that an almost universal anxiety in research on pregnant women is their concern that the infant is developing well, concern that there might be neurological and developmental failures. So the argument went, if stress isn't good for the mothers and for their babies, maybe reduction of stress can improve the situation for both the mothers and the babies. So they undertook the following experiment. They took a group of pregnant women and they randomly assigned them to one of two conditions. In the first condition, they did an ultrasound of the fetus. And while they took the ultrasound, they pointed out to the mother the various parts of the baby and kept giving a running commentary. Oh, the baby looks great. See, the skull is well formed here. The development is going well there. And the mother could see on the pictures that resulted from the sonograms. For the second group, and that was, we'll call that the experimental intervention to allay the mother's anxiety. For the second group, they also gave the mothers an ultrasound. The doctors read the ultrasound and came back and said to the mother subsequently, everything looks fine, there's nothing to worry about, development is proceeding normally. But the mothers never saw the results of the ultrasound and she wasn't walked through as the doctor identified the various parts of the body. Well, this is a very small manipulation, and you might wonder whether such a small manipulation could have any effect whatsoever. In fact, it did. First of all, there were fewer birth complications in the experimental group than in the comparison group. And second, the babies during the first few months of life were healthier, less irritable, cried less than the babies in the comparison group. All right, what is the process? The process, I think, is not very difficult. I'll get to you in just a minute. First of all, we know that under stress there is the release of epinephrine, that epinephrine has an effect on the mother's central nervous system, on her physiology and her biochemistry, and that these changes are transmitted to the baby via the placenta. So that what I'm arguing is that stress, for example, in the mother, can be communicated to the infant and has been shown to have, both in animal work, in naturalistic and uncontrolled human work, and in the experimental work in the reduction of anxiety, has been shown to have an effect on the fetus and its development and the subsequent development of the infant. Now, there were a few questions. There was one at the back somewhere. Questions?
How significant are these studies? Is there a little difference? Is it real
Yes.
significant?
Yes, it's a good question. Is it a massive effect? And if it's a massive effect, then why don't all doctors immediately do sonograms and walk the mother through the results? The effect is statistically significant. That means it can be replicated, it doesn't occur by chance, and it's relatively small. You don't take a mother who's a working jangle of nerves, show her a sonogram, and she becomes a totally calm, placid, easy-going pregnant mother. We don't bring about effects of that order of magnitude. So they tend to be small. You tend to see them best at a group level. By that I mean if you have 100 women in each group, you find on average there's a difference between the two groups, and it needn't necessarily work for any given individual at all. So you need to look at it at the group level of data. The effects are small, replicable, and significant. Yes?
How is the baby crying judged? Is the mother asked? If the mother is asked, is it possible that the mother develops a relationship with the child a little more intimately by understanding all of its parts in birth and therefore feels that maybe the child is closer to her and she's not going to criticize and say it's crying and pregnancy is harder?
I think you raise a very good issue. The issue is, how do we judge? I mean, if it's the mother's report, is the mother in some way a contaminated observer? Is she not a very good observer? Either she can be more empathic with the cries, or maybe she could exaggerate the cries, or we could play out the scenario a number of different ways. 2 or 3 ways that's judged. In some of the best research, they send an observer into the home of the infant for several hours on several days, and they simply sit there with a timer and they take notes and they do what's called detailed timed observations. Usually every 10 seconds you record the behavior that occurs. Right? In other work, they judge as the child is brought to the pediatrician's office. As you know, very young babies in the first year of life see the pediatrician quite often. And so the pediatrician is brought into this, and he contributes how restless and irritable was the baby. But in addition, most also do get information from the mother as to how often the baby cries. Babies, in fact, cry, especially in the first few months, quite a lot. And so mothers can give you some information, but we don't know how good they are. Some mothers have a much lower tolerance for crying than others. But even when you get objective accounts, you get very real differences in babies and the extent to which they cry, the extent to which they're ready to be soothed. This we call soothability is another important factor. Right? Other questions? There was someone back here before. All right, so I'm arguing that the prenatal environment of the fetus is more than just the uterus of the mother, that what goes on in the mother can affect the infant, and stress is one important factor that can affect the infant. There are others as well, others that are more well known, and I'm only just going to mention them briefly in passing. Clearly, drugs can cross the placenta from the mother to the infant, and clearly drugs have effect on the developing fetus. We know, for example, about fetal alcohol syndrome, which is associated with retardation, which has a particular facial structure, facial features associated with it, and occurs when the mother takes a high intake of alcohol. Perhaps you mightn't know that nicotine also has an effect on the developing fetus. For example, there are 30% more miscarriages in mothers who are heavy smokers compared to non-smokers, even when we control for social class, nutrition, and other factors as well. Women who smoke have smaller babies, have a higher incidence of prematurity, and even for full-term babies, they have more low birth weight babies. In addition, there are even more marked effects of drugs such as heroin and crack, and I don't know if those of you who've been reading the papers recently have been following the whole concern about what's called border babies. Babies that are left at the hospital and who stay there for months and months, in some cases more than a year, because they don't have where to place these addicted babies after birth. Addicted babies are very irritable, very difficult to deal with, and in many cases the mothers abandon them, and the hospitals don't have where to send the infants, so they occupy wards of hospitals. And it's really a concern what to do with these addicted babies called border babies because they're boarded in the hospital. All right, illness in the mother is of course well known. Perhaps the two best examples is rubella during the first trimester of pregnancy and its effect on the developing fetus. Also diabetes in the mother also has effects on the fetus, and suspected other illnesses as well. The age of the mother and the parity of the mother are also associated with the development of the fetus. And maternal nutrition, the clearest example is the absence of the iodine deficiency and cretinism in infants. Cretinism is a very marked form of retardation together with growth problems in infants. But even chronic malnutrition, not of a specific substance, but simply in terms of caloric and protein intake, is associated with lower intellectual performance of infants and children. It's not just limited to the first few weeks or months of life, but for the years of life of the infant. And we can change this by the use of vitamin supplements. And in some parts of the country where there is in fact a high incidence of chronic malnutrition, part of the standard fare of treatment of pregnancy, of management of pregnancy, is vitamin supplements. All right, let me leave the prenatal environment and move to birth and delivery. I want to describe very quickly what goes on in the United States in a typical birth procedure, and then very, very briefly talk about some variations on this. The traditional Labor and delivery is as follows. The woman goes into labor, the husband times the contractions, calls the doctor. Doctor says at a certain point, when the contractions are relatively close, go to the hospital. The husband supposedly drives very fast and anxiously. He gets to the hospital, he heaves a sigh of relief. When the nurses take his wife, he goes out to the store, buys his cigars, and he paces the floor thinking he's doing a great deal of hard work, while his woman's in some inner sanctum somewhere, tended by nurses and doctors and professionals. For the woman, she doesn't have the ease of pacing the floor. Her contractions come closer and closer together. She's checked by nurses. She's generally alone in a room, or there might be another woman in labor in an adjacent room or an adjacent bed. At a certain point, when the birth is imminent, she's taken into the labor room. She's usually put in stirrups. She is sometimes, very often, more than 90% of the cases, given some form of analgesia or anesthesia, often a spinal or a caudal. The doctor delivers the baby. He holds the baby up to the wife, who says, "This is your baby. Isn't he or she beautiful?" The baby is cleaned. The drops put in the baby's eyes. The baby's bundled up and taken to the nursery. The doctor then attends to the mother. There might be stitches from an episiotomy. There's still the afterbirth to be delivered. The mother is looked after, and then she's wheeled into a recovery room, and then she's sent back to the ward, and she goes 6 or 8 hours till she sees, 4 to 6 hours until she next sees her baby again. All right. The question has been raised again and again whether this is the optimal procedure for either mother or baby, and you might mention the father in this very traditional birthing practice has played a very peripheral role of sort of pacing the floor in the waiting room. So I want to consider now what are some of the effects of some of the ways in which babies are born, and what are the alternatives, and what are the effects, and what do we know about them. So I want to consider, first of all, medicated versus natural childbirth. I mentioned that medicated childbirth is normal in the United States. More than 90% of all births are medicated. We know the anesthesia and analgesias pass rapidly into the infant's bloodstream via the placenta, and the effects on the newborn are very clear. Babies that have had mothers who've been medicated show less vigorous sucking when they're put to the breast. 4 weeks later, they still have poorer vision. There is a lag in their muscular and neural development that remains the first 4 or 6 weeks of life. There is an effect on the mother as well. The mothers who are sedated tend to be not very active participants in the birth process. They tend to feel less good about the birth process. And what we know is that how mothers feel about the birth process relates to their sensitivity as mothers in the first 6 weeks of mothering the infant. Well, what is it like for the mother who has natural childbirth? First of all, these mothers experience less pain. I should mention, natural childbirth is almost always accompanied by prenatal classes and exercise classes prior to the birth. So it's not just a refusal to take medication, but it's also preparation as well. These mothers experience less pain in childbirth. Their self-image is enhanced, and they describe a peak experience, an emotional high, the kind of which one rarely has in life. One has only 2 or 3 or 4 times in one's life, called a peak experience. They have cesarean sections significantly less often, 25% less often, and the fetus shows distress less often, approximately 20% less often. Now, in these studies, the subjects, the patients who had both medicated and natural childbirth, were matched in terms of age, social class, and parity. But what they weren't matched in is their motivation to have natural childbirth. So we have in this research a problem of self-selected samples. And the question is whether those people who chose to have natural childbirth were different to begin with. And the research cannot address that. Yes?
I don't know if this is true. I was wondering, I was told that by some mother, that it wasn't really worth it to get the medication anyway because of the fact that they give it so late in the process that most of the pain has passed anyway, and that I mean, that was an advantage to natural childbirth, was that this medication was given so late in the birth process that it was kind of like, why bother? That was what, at least that's what she felt, and I was wondering if that was true.
I don't know exactly how one gets really good data on that, because once you've got the medication, then it's very easy to say, look, I could have gone on that much longer anyway, but you don't know. It certainly is not a comfortable procedure. I mean, labour pains are not comfortable by any stretch of the imagination, and they're long and protracted and they don't stop. So I think each person has a different threshold at which they feel comfortable and of what they can tolerate, and I wouldn't like to give a ruling for all women in all places at all times. So I think these are very personal decisions as to how one handles the distress associated with birth. All right, a second area, a second concern that people have had is the removal of the infant from the mother immediately after the birth of the baby. Usually, as I mentioned, the baby is cleaned and removed, swaddled, and then sent to the infant nursery. Now, the argument has been that immediately after births, in humans, as in animals, there is a sensitive period during which bonding, attachment, intimate connection is readily established between the mother and the infants. And that if we separate the mother and child, we put up a barrier to the establishment of this important and profound sort of bonding experience. And so in the last decade or so, there's been significant experimentation with having mothers and babies stay together immediately after birth. Now, typically in such situations, immediately after the infant is born, the infant is cleaned and given to the mother, and they stay together in the recovery room for approximately an hour or an hour and a half under heating lamps, because the newborn infant has trouble regulating temperature. And the mother and infant get to know each other. Now, this works most effectively if the mother, in fact, has not been medicated, if she's alert and if she's awake. Well, there's degrees of medication. I don't wish you to think there is an all or none that you sort of knock the woman out. And of course, then she's not much use to the baby. There are spinals and caudals and epidurals. There are all kinds of anesthetics that give the mother greater or lesser awareness and involvement. At any rate, the experimental evidence is that those mothers who've had this immediate contact after birth, in fact, tend to be warmer and more responsive to their infants compared to those mothers who didn't have that contact in the immediate short term, that is for the first few days while they're still in hospital with their infants. Thereafter, the effect erodes, so it's not a very long-lasting effect. But the effect is most pronounced for those whose mothering is at risk. I'm going to stop here and we'll continue next class.